and the construction of an American world order, right here. It's also going to be available for sale outside right after this event. And John Sewell, a senior scholar at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholar. Those of you unfamiliar with the center, the Wilson Center was established by Act of Congress in 1968. It is the nation's official living memorial to President Woodrow Wilson. It was founded in honor, to honor and build upon his legacy as a man who bridged the divide between scholarship and public policy. At the Wilson Center, we bring together the thinkers and the doers, policymakers, scholars, and business leaders in the hope and the belief that a frank and open dialogue will lead to a better understanding, cooperation, and public policy. Within the Wilson Center, the Cold War International History Project, which is part of the Center's History and Public Policy program, new sources, materials, and perspective from the former communist bloc with a historiography of the Cold War. We seek to transcend barriers of language, geography, and regional specialty to create new links among scholars interested in Cold War history. Among the various activities undertaken by the project are the publication of the bulletin, copies of which are available outside for you to pick up, publications of working papers, the Cold War Project's virtual archive, which remains to this day the largest collection of translated documents from the former communist bloc, available for free online, as well as international scholarly meetings, conferences, and book discussions like the one today. Today's discussion, featuring David Ekblad, newly published book, exemplifies the Center's commitment to dialogue, understanding, and cooperation among policymakers and scholars. David is assistant professor of history at Tufts University and a research fellow with the International Security Program at the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs at the John F. Kennedy School of Government of Harvard University. This is his first book, The Great American Mission. Has just been published by Princeton University. He's currently working on a second book that traces the rise of a new American globalism in the 1930s. Commenting on the book is John Sewell, who is a senior scholar at the Woodrow Wilson Center. His current research analyzes how globalization has affected the American national interest in the developing world. In 2008, he chaired the experts group that produced a memo to the next president promoting American interests through smarter, more strategic global policies that called for a new national development strategy. He has also published a Wilson Center policy paper entitled The Realpolitik of Ending Poverty, an Action Plan for American Foreign Policy. He is the former president of Overseas Development Council and has written extensively on globalization and development issues. David will speak for about 30 minutes or so, followed by comments from John, and then we'll open it up to Q&A. Please wait for the microphone. We're actually taping this. It will be posted up on the website shortly, so just please wait for the microphone and ID yourself before you ask the questions. David, the floor is yours.
All right. Thank you. Thank you, Mircea, and thank you, John, for being here. Thank you all for coming. Without looking like I'm desperately trying to ingratiate myself with the center, I really want to thank the center for having me, not only as a platform to discuss my book, but it's an honor to be connected with the Cold War International History Project, which is an extraordinary operation. I don't think it's too much to say, has revolutionized the history of the Cold War and our understanding of international affairs globally. So thanks again for having me. And it's a useful thing, perhaps, to talk at the Wilson Center about a topic that straddles the Cold War. That's very important to understanding the Cold War as well as international affairs before it and obviously after it. We're at a point where Barack Obama is reconsidering the U.S. posture toward development. We're waiting with bated breath for the QDDR, the Quadrennial Diplomacy and Development Review that Hillary Clinton's doing. that is billed as the biggest rethink, repositioning of American development strategy since the 1961 Aid Act, which created USAID. So this thing, development, that in the period I'm discussing was very often synonymous with a process called modernization, remains a central theme in how the U.S. approaches world affairs, structures its foreign policy, and conceptualizes problems in the world. And that's one of the things I was trying to get at with this book, is where are the origins of certain ideas, where did certain ideas go, in the sense of where do they go in the world, and then how do they change? How do they change over time? And I did want to take some of these ideas back before the Cold War. There is a tendency for scholars and people in the development community, I mean, literally there are people who say development as we understand it, international development as an American policy or as an ethos begins really in the 1940s. I mean, this is how it's said by some scholars, or the key moment is in the 1940s and the Cold War. And one of the points of the book, even though the center of gravity is on the Cold War, is to ask, well, really was it? And look at some of the proximate origins of some ideas that were dominant in global discussion of development, but also the American strategy and American policy and practice of development, and that this was emerging in the 1930s out of the Depression, out of the crisis of ideological combat in the 1930s and 40s, World War II, and it gets transmitted into the Cold War and becomes an important part of the Cold War. And because of this, I mean, it relates very strongly to a strand in Cold War history that the center has been, the center's own work has, I think, undergirded in many ways, which is the new Cold War history or the new international history often talks about how the Cold War itself is a very ideological struggle. It's a struggle between various ideological systems, two big ideological systems, obviously, the Soviet Union and the United States, but also other units of the struggle that have their own ideological views. But very often it's talked about in a very broad way, and one of the goals of the book is to pull this down to earth a little bit and say, well, how is ideology, each side's ideology, legitimated and justified globally? Why is development so important, not only as a way of building a strong and viable anti-communist state in Korea, but also a way of showing that the American liberal capitalist system works? Why is that important in this? And it's to bring that Cold War discussion down to earth, but also to say that some of this is actually forming before the Cold War. My point in the book, too, is not to say that development, and just as a short, there are you could get into some very good and very technical definitions of development. But development, I sort of as a shorthand and hopefully not too glib statement about it, is as a process to guide progress. That development has many antecedents, the civilizing mission that colonial powers, that includes the United States, took on in the 19th and early 20th centuries. The concept of reconstruction, not only the American reconstruction in the South, but a broader concept among reformers in the early 20th century of reforming modern society to fit the demands of life. Reconstruction was discussed. That there are ideas before the period I'm discussing, which again is about most of the book is focused on the 1930s to about the 1970s. There are antecedents, right? It doesn't sort of spring from the ground, the concept of development and modernization. But that there's a proximate origin to these things, that there's a moment of crystallization, and that's in the 1930s and in the ideological hothouse of the 1930s. And hopefully what I'm doing here is not only bringing light to aspects of the Cold War that are very important, but also showing that an important theme in international life that's still at play in a very revised form very different in application and discussion, but is still very important to not only the United States but to the global community, has a longer history, and that it comes into the Cold War and gets bent and refracted by it and changed very dramatically by various things in the period of the Cold War and by the Cold War itself, and then comes out the other end of it. And I think that's how we have to understand certain global themes, is that they change over time. If there's any old saw historians have, is that there's change over time. Anyway, so it lets us, hopefully it lets us step back and see some larger trends. I tend to talk, tend to put a little focus narratively, but also on the example, when I talk about these proximate origins, of the Tennessee Valley Authority. This is the, up here you'll see the Wilson Dam, which is emblematic of the TVA. I mean, to this day, when you say TVA, the Tennessee Valley Authority, to people, they still think of dams and electricity. I come back to two Americans who were younger men at this time, David Lilienthal, who was a director of the Tennessee Valley Authority, and Eugene Staley, who was a up-and-coming economist who, like many economists in this period, gets into international economics and then moves into development economics in the 40s and 50s. It was a migratory path for a lot of economists and people interested in these issues because they were so important and intense in this period for various reasons. Both are Westerners, both are internationalists, and both are liberals. And they'll be coming back into my discussion at a couple of points. Lilienthal tends to crop up a lot. He's almost the poster boy for a certain type of New Deal liberalism in the United States, in the sense that he goes to Harvard Law School. He's picked up by Felix Frankfurter, who connects him with all sorts of people, as Frankfurter did. He goes on to progressive work in the Midwest, and then he's tapped by FDR to be one of the initial directors of TVA. He then runs TVA. Later he'll be the director. He'll be the sole director. He'll become a mouthpiece for the idea of liberal development as embodied by the TVA, go on to run the Atomic Energy Commission, then go run his own private development firm, work across the world, work in the Shah's Iran on key projects, and in South Vietnam. So he's the emblem of the transmission of these New Deal ideas overseas, that they get picked up and caught up in America's increasing global engagement, its global presence, and in the Cold War. But why is he attractive, particularly for being the guy who's around the TVA in the early and mid and late 1930s? Because TVA was, as James Scott, a prominent political scientist who writes on this, wrote a famous book called Seeing Like a State, calls TVA the granddaddy of all regional development projects. And I completely agree with James Scott. It very much is, because it embodies a lot of ideas that are already out there, that have emerged in the progressive period in the early 20th centuries, in the early 1930s, but also are really amped up by the Depression, as people are trying to solve the problem of modern societies grappling with economic crisis, where societies we see as industrialized and modern, including the United States itself, are doing internal development, economic and social development, in everything but name. And that's why TVA is so popular. It is a multi-purpose project to create multi-purpose people. That's what they call it, in the sense that TVA is not just electricity and dams and agricultural reforms. The idea, as Lilienthal himself is saying, but a lot of other people are saying, the idea is to change how people work, interact, and think. It's very, very similar to the way people talk about what they're going to do to people in this large swath of the poor and backward, as they call it at the time, American South, is very, very similar to how people in the developing world, or the third world, as it's called during the Cold War, are discussed. this is the 1940s. One of the things TVA did was teach people how to use modern electrical appliances, how they could be used, how they could change your business. Simply that these were available. That's at the other end of the big dams, the electrical power plants, that they get out and change people's lives, and they're supposed to change how people live. And how families are organized. I mean, it's pretty dramatic. Some of this is, the thinking of social reformers. Some of this is actually, just what they're speculating about. Some of this is actually what they try to do, and they organize education programs, all sorts of other programs around it. Again, it's a template for what's going to come later, that technological change will breed social and even psychological change, right? The modernization theorists, who are not a center point of the book, people like Daniel Lerner and Walt Rostow and others, I think are kind of coming to the party later and defining things in the 1950s and 60s that are already happening. So when they're writing books about the modernization of man and the modernization of societies, they're following what is already being implemented and has already been tried in other places, in other parts of the world, including their own country. And also TVA does an inordinate number of subsidiary programs, education programs, obviously, urban planning, and disease eradication. Famously, they have a very successful malaria eradication program. These are also part of the larger package for international development. That international development is going to be extensive in scope and invasive in what it's trying to do. I mean, one of the points of the book is to say that programs like these don't just offer a piece of technology. They're very often offering a different way of life, but that is necessarily an invasive thing. Very personal, very, very direct in this. And that TVA also makes space for something that will be part and parcel of international development today. In fact, it's become a greater part of it today. But very much in the American case, but it's true internationally in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, and well into the Cold War, that it makes a space for cooperation with NGOs, as we would broadly call them, civil society organizations. Some of the things the TVA can't actually do, so it calls upon voluntary groups and universities and local governments to do certain things. This is how the U.S. government will operate abroad from the get-go. In fact, when some of these programs the first foreign aid bureaucracies are institutionalized in the 40s and early 50s, the first thing they do is they go to the NGOs. They go to missionaries. They go to places like the Near East Foundation, the Rockefeller Foundation, and ask them for their know-how, because these are the people who've also been out there before. Part of the story, too, is that as these new ideas are forming in the 1930s, very quickly groups that have been doing work overseas for a long time, that, like I said, development is a process that, by many other guises has been going on various ways, immediately gravitate to this and watch TVA, because their idea is, this is what we've been hoping for. TVA actually, interestingly enough, becomes a huge destination. It becomes a huge destination starting in the 1930s. It really accelerates after the war for people to come and see how modernization should be done. The World Bank sponsors tours, the UN sponsors tours. But they start in the 1930s because people see something that they've already been looking for, and because it embodies a lot of ideas that are already out there but have been put together in one package. This is why in the Cold War you often find people saying, what we need is a TVA. We'd like something like a TVA. And you find it globally. You find it across the world. Right? This is from the Milwaukee Journal, talking about where the TVA idea has gone. Either people are talking about their programs as this, or they are literally, they are saying we're doing it in the spirit of the TVA, or they're actually I won't quite say borrowing the blueprint, but they're trying to do something almost from very directly inspired by the TVA idea. And this gets to one of the other points of the book, is that TVA is ideological. And it stands for a broader brand of liberal development, because liberal developmentalism in the 1930s emerges as a way to combat the threat of dangerous ideological systems, right? Fascism and then communism. These systems, too, in the middle of a world grappling with economic and social insecurity, offer a vision of the future. And in fact, in parts of the 1930s, they look like they've got the better idea, the idea that can be better implemented. And a lot of liberals grasp this as a way of getting a handle on a world they feel may be slipping from their grasp. But the important part of it, and this gets back to David Lilienthal, is that they have to craft a system that looks very similar to Soviet five-year plans. It can look very similar to things that are being, Mussolini's Agropontino, which was a massive agricultural reform program in Italy in the 1930s, with a key part that I haven't mentioned about TVA. TVA accepts the state as a center point, right? It may organize NGOs. It may work through local government, but it is a U.S. government-created organization, private corporation technically, but a bureaucracy, to coordinate and do this activity. And it's statist, and that looks dangerous. It also doesn't look liberal. It looks dangerously like other things that are being offered out there ideologically. And that's why Lilienthal and many supporters talk a lot about how the TVA, because of its political content, because of how it operates with other institutions, is an emblem of grassroots democracy. And that becomes an important part of its appeal, right? It becomes an important part of its appeal. And it does appeal. It's used very directly in World War II. I think one of the things that's been overlooked by scholars more than anything else is how World War II itself is in some ways a development argument. I touch on this in the book, but the Germans are saying to, conquered Europe, you don't want liberal ideas back. You want the empire we're trying to give you. And one of the things they do is Lilienthal writes a little book called TVA Democracy on the March that if you read it, it's a beautiful piece of American rhetoric. It's actually in the canon. There's a book on the American intellectual tradition by a leading scholar that has parts of Lilienthal's work in it, because it talks about grassroots democracy. It talks about this vision in such an effective way. The Office of War Information translates this book and distributes it across the world as a way of containing the appeal of fascism and also looking to contain the appeal of communism, which also offer development. So TVA establishes itself as this benchmark for a liberal approach to development that can do big plans, big ideas, broad transformations, which is why in the Cold War, it emerges very quickly as a synonym for what the U.S. is often trying to do in other parts of the world. Why so many places say they want a TVA to appeal to the Americans. The Americans talk about TVA as, to make the American public and world publics understand what they're trying to do. When Truman sets out to reconstruct South Korea, the first people he turns to are TVA staffers after the Korean War. Even though they don't do a quote-unquote TVA for Korea, they employ all of these ideas in places like South Korea, which is vitally important because it's the biggest modernization program in the world in the 1950s. But it embodies this cooperation where the American state is coordinating a whole bunch of institutions, which now include international bodies like the UN and its litter of specialized agencies. When the U.S. goes into Vietnam, famously, Lyndon Johnson says, we'll leave our footprints in Vietnam. We're going to leave a TVA on the Mekong, in essence, he says. That's not idle talk, because he recruits Lilienthal to do a high-profile program to show that the U.S. is committed to South Vietnam and that the U.S. will, post-war, have a massive development program to recreate South Vietnam along liberal lines. A really thorough program of economic and social development. They never get a chance to implement this, but the fact that Lilienthal and his guys are deployed to do this is an important part of the story. That the Shah's Iran, right, when it wants to cement its authority, and here's the irony of this, when the Shah's Iran wants to cement its authority after the Shah's put back in power by the United States in a coup in the 1950s, it embarks on a huge national development program to harness the rivers in southeastern Iran. Who do they hire? Lilienthal's private development corporation. Development and Resources, they go in to help the Shah do this. But the irony here is that in Iran, this actually leads to catastrophe. The program's not a success. There are political problems. There are problems with implementation. That's often the case with these bigger programs. And it coincides with a period of crisis for the larger ideas about development in the 1960s and early 1970s, a crisis of development that actually leads to one of the reasons John's been press-ganged into commenting here is things like the Overseas Development Council emerge as part of a debate about where development is going to go, because many mainstream ideas have been so challenged by problems with implementation and environmental critique, critiques about the social costs of this, some of the things that the very extensive nature of these programs in some ways undercut them. These ideas in a lot of the institutions never quite go away. Infrastructure, even some of the commitments to social change never quite disappear from the equation. But the way we discuss development, some of the actors in development are fundamentally changed by this. For example, USAID, which is a huge organization compared to today, has about 18,000 people worldwide, is slashed because of this crisis, because of a lot of new ideas emerging out of this crisis of development in the 1970s. When people in Washington lament that we don't have the capacity to do the things we want to do in Iraq or Afghanistan or anywhere because it's not in the government anymore, they're lamenting the changes brought about by this crisis. That's sort of the tail end of the book. And in fact, what's interesting is that some of the NGOs come back in the sense that the government then looks to international organizations and NGOs to execute. It's why USAID today is often derided as a contracting agency, because they hand the work over for political cover to various private groups, but pre-existing NGOs. One thing I should also say just quickly, and I'll stop. The relationship with NGOs is one I wanted to draw out. If there's just a little bit of, not trivia, but a bit of a non sequitur for what I've been talking about, when Kennedy proposes the Peace Corps, it's modeled on the efforts of NGOs that are being very successful, that have a long tradition of being successful overseas, but have been doing work with the U.S. government under contract. They very much support the creation of the Peace Corps. And the first places to train the Peace Corps are places, are various organizations that have emerged out of a missionary background, the International Voluntary Service, which isn't around anymore. But also, interestingly, in a whole bunch of other places, CARE does programs to train early Peace Corps volunteers, and the Tennessee Valley Authority train the first ranks of Peace Corps volunteers, right? These things are, connected all together. Anyway, so even today now, and one other point to go back to wrap it up, one of the other things that emerges out of this is an institution that's not too far down the street. The World Bank grows into a development mission, right? It sort of takes us over. It's sort of slow to do this. But one of the things that comes out of the crisis of development in the 60s and 70s is an extreme emphasis on the UN. The U.S. puts a lot more money into the bank. The bank itself grows into a role not just as a lender, but as Robert McNamara, who takes it over in this critical period, he wants to turn it into a development agency. It's why it is now I don't know if it's now the leading source of capital, but the looming center of the development community for the last generation is a product of this shift. The bank gets moved into this role. Anyway, so the larger point is this history not only, I hope, gives us something to bring some of the ideological elements of the Cold War down to the ground, but also to understand the terrain we're on today, the longer origins of some of the ideas and practices where they went, but some of the conundrums, some of the policy debates that are being wrestled with right now are part of this larger history. So I hope the book illuminates it all on those issues. Thank you.
Thank you. John.
Well, David, thank you. That was a very quick summary of a very rich book, I must say. But first, let me give you a little bit of full disclosure. I had the privilege of reading and commenting on earlier versions of this manuscript, so I'm not an unbiased observer. Mm-hmm. And by the same token, as you can tell from my white beard, I either observed or participated in a number of the events that are in the book, so I have a certain lack of objectivity about what happened. I'm not going to give you a critique of the book. Because I think it's a real and important contribution to an understanding of how throughout the 20th century, American concepts of modernization and development, burgeoning out of TVA, the New Deal, the Progressive Movement, also out of the American missionary experience and various other activities, have put forth a conception of modernization and development that's been sustained as the leitmotif of U.S. foreign policy and of academic analysis, I think, except in the latter years, academic analysis has dropped off very heavily. And for that reason, for those of you who remember Rap Brown, the black activist who once said about violence, it's American as apple pie, so too is development as American as apple pie. And we tend to forget it because Americans, being deeply ahistorical, forget that we've been down this path before, both domestically and internationally. Therefore, it's a very worthwhile canvas to look to the future. Now, the interesting part about it is that the books arrived, as David said briefly at the beginning, at a very propitious time, because at the moment there's broad spread agreement in Washington without on a broad consensus that leads the findings of the book, the analysis of the book, to be very useful. First of all, everybody agrees that the U.S. capacities to promote development are broken. There's a marvelous chart somewhere that shows that 12 cabinet agencies, I can't do this off the top of my head, a large number of other organizations, I think 60 government offices are involved in one or another aspect of U.S. government development policy. That doesn't speak for the private sector, the foundations and business and everybody else. There's also a growing consensus, as reflected in particularly in the Obama administration, that development, I don't mean just foreign aid, but development is of central importance to meet a whole range of U.S. national interests. And those American interests really center around how you create a growing number of what I call competent partners. Competent partners are countries with governments that are capable to do what governments should do, keep security, collect taxes, et cetera, and have some form of popular voice in the key decisions that affect them. You can call it democracy if you want. There's lots of other vehicles of the same kind. But where there's some consent of the governed to what's happening with them, in them. Now, David, I don't think, had time to get into the demise of the development business in the United States, but increasingly after the 1961 reforms, the last time, by the way, the legislation was fully rewritten, the concern about development has gone downhill within the U.S. government, not outside. And by that time, aid had become a shell of its former self. The policy environment had changed. There were many more donors. The U.S. is no longer although it's the biggest donor in financial terms. Most of the money, speaking now, goes to very few countries in the Middle East and obviously Afghanistan and Iraq. Most countries, the U.S., as I said, is not the biggest donor. There are many other people running around. And the U.S. is not yet, and what the U.S. government does about trade policy, what it does about the international financial crisis, what it does about dealing with global diseases, just as important as anything it has done in the past. The fact that there's this broad consensus on agreement, as David alluded to, means that development is now on the policy agenda. Well, it's not very clear where it's going at the moment. Both the President and the Secretary of State, in their statements after their election and appointment to their jobs, announced that development would receive equal emphasis to diplomacy and defense in U.S. foreign policy. They've launched, there are 3 major efforts underway as we speak to deal with rethinking the development programs of the U.S. One's the quadrennial Diplomacy and Development Review, patterned on the long-existing defense review of the DoD. They're supposed to make recommendations sometime this year. The White House, at the same time, started an overall review of all U.S. agencies involved in development policy in some way or another. As I said, there are a huge number of them, which also will report this year. And Congress, for the first time in a very long time, is making development policy reform a priority. Both the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and the House Foreign Affairs Committee are engaged in rewriting legislation. The Senate Foreign Relations Committee has also already produced an interim bill. So the issue, as they say, is on the table. So far, however, as we're now more than a year into the Obama administration, the process has been disappointing. It's very opaque. No one knows what's going to come out of these things. It's being closely held within the administration. And there's a growing belief that real change really won't happen. Certainly not this year, maybe not even in Obama's first term. And if that's actually true, and it can change dramatically, then a real opportunity has been lost, won't appear for a while. So David ends the book with a statement I'm about to read, which when you buy the book, you can find it on page 272. I actually read it again.
Oh. At least one person has.
And it underscores the reason why policymakers should read this book. And I would urge, David, as I have before, now's the time to write an article in Foreign Affairs, Foreign Policy, or somewhere which makes relevant what is in the book to the discussions that are going on now, because it's important.
I am actually trying.
Good.
It's hard when assistant professor comes before your name to get into the list.
Yeah, but there'll be an audience for it, I guarantee you. And it also ends, as I said, with a critical issue for those who believe that modernization and development need to be a key component of U.S. foreign policy. And I just want to reiterate that promoting development or modernization, and the distinction is very useful, by the way, as I said, meets key interests, of which foreign aid is only a very small tool in what the U.S. should be doing. As I said, international economic factors and even foreign policy loom very large in this. David says at the end, it says, international crises at the start of the new millennium again found liberals mobilizing the ideas and institutions of development to meet a threat. Threat, of course, terrorism. In what is now much more plural international discourse, that's a polite way of saying there are an awful lot of people running around there trying to do things in development, including the Chinese and even Indians, which now has a very large program in Afghanistan. In that atmosphere, policymakers and thinkers grapple with the question of what and how development will be implemented in this new world situation. This ferment's not produced a consensus. For all the calls to integrate and cooperate, planning remains discredited. The state is still viewed with suspicion. Various practices continue to attract criticism. The Washington Consensus, grassroots development, et cetera, et cetera. And voices in the debate often advocate divergent approaches. I myself, and I'll end on this note, think that there is a nascent consensus on for what reason development is important to the United States. It's the competent partners issue. How are we going to deal with countries on global warming or global pandemics, what have you, who have very little private or public capacities to understand and deal with them and very little financing. But that agenda of issues is a diverse range of cross-cutting issues. It obviously includes preventing violent conflicts. And the large issue here is a serious attempt, which has not been taken on, about where we really face threats for which military security, military force is a useful instrument of foreign policy. My own view is, by the way, that we will not do in Iraq or Afghanistan for a long time. Again, so that's one issue. The other is restoring global economic growth and dampening financial instability. You've got India and China growing at 10% a year. They're huge export markets for the United States in individual cases and in the collectivity of fast-growing middle-income countries that buy most of U.S. goods, both raw materials and manufactured goods. Third part of it is expanding global trade. The fourth is obviously dealing with global climate change, which is quintessentially a development issue, but also a global public good. As is the fifth part of the consensus, which is dealing with global pandemics and other health challenges. A few years ago, the CIA made an analysis that said all of the scientific research says at least 30 or 40 new diseases have emerged since 1970, and the odds are that many new ones will emerge, as they have, of course, avian flu and so on and so forth. And finally, that consensus includes eliminating absolute poverty. Why? Because the world's not going to work very well if a very, very large number of people in the world still try and live on below $2 a day. And that gives you problems of disease, of deterioration of the environment, in some cases of conflict, although poverty is not the case, not the cause of conflict. And for all of these issues, modernization and development remain very important, and therefore understanding what went before us and avoiding the mistakes that were made or the false parallels were made between the American experience and the reality in the developing countries is extraordinarily important. For that reason, I recommend all of you buy the book and recommend to your colleagues in the business that they take a look at it too. And David hopefully will produce the cliff notes in a journal article which will make it very clear why these are so important. Thank you.
Thank you. By the way, John doesn't get a cut of any proceeds, so that's an unsolicited testimonial.
Thank you both. Before I open it up to questions from the audience, let me just try to throw you for a loop a little bit. And since here at the Cold War Project we deal primarily with the communist world, I found it interesting that the crisis in development in U.S. foreign policy happens exactly in the mid-50s, early 70s, as at the zenith, basically, of Soviet and communist power in terms of their own programs of development. And I was wondering if you want to, maybe expand a little bit on that. Was it because in the process of national liberation and decolonization, was there a crisis in development on the U.S. part because those people were choosing the Soviet model for development and were choosing the Soviet model for organizing the society, or was there something inside the U.S. process that basically wasn't functioning very well that brought in the crisis? And where did those things fit? That was one, and the other question I had, and I think they can be combined in some way. To what extent was there any sort of attempt to get some of the experiences or at least look at what the other two major development models that were happening? And you touched a little bit about it, but it seemed that you were implying that liberal development on the U.S. side was a reaction to and basically just keeping at arm's length the other two models, which were fascism and communism. Mm-hmm. Was there any, for one thing, we've imported a lot of know-how from the Germans after World War II in rockets and stuff like that. Were we trying to import some know-how in terms of what was actually a very successful model for development inside Germany in the 1930s?
because it was. So.
Yeah, internally we take it. We wouldn't call this a development project, but we take something from the Germans, the interstate highway system, right? Eisenhower sees the Autobahn and brings it home. Yeah, so there's always that back and forth. So maybe I'll start with that.
Okay.
And say that there's a subtlety here that some of the things that go into development, liberal developmentalism, fascist, if you want to call it fascist developmentalism, communist development, are sort of not to sound like I'm trying to be too vogue of scholarly language, but are transnational epistemic communities, in the sense that they're all using, they're all referencing certain types of technology, right? That is cuts across borders. Everybody's drawing on everybody else to understand hydraulic engineering, some things about agricultural science. They are literally taking pages from each other. I mean, the Soviets are fascinated in the 20s and 30s by aspects of American industrialization and development, and they're
Henry Ford.
Yeah, exactly. Fordism, American agricultural practices. So there's this constant back and forth, and that's why looking at ideology is very important, because the programs are often very, very similar, and that's true in execution. That's true almost in ambition, but the politics that surround it, that sometimes it's a setup. They're not that there isn't really the grassroots democracy that some people talk about, but sometimes there are democratic elements and liberal elements that do actually change how these things are applied. So politics becomes very important because they actually, in terms of technology and goals, look very similar, and there is definitely a connection. The interesting point is, German engineers in the teens, 20s, and 30s, even though they read American journals about hydrology and dam construction engineering, there is this tendency to sort of look at it through an ideological prism, that we're doing this better because we're doing it in a very whatever way is predominating. But also a nationalistic perspective. The Americans simply aren't as efficient as we are. So it cuts both ways, but there are these lines that are drawn even as everybody's drawing technically from each other, and looking very similar. So the politics becomes very important. And that's why Lilienthal stands out among the developmentalists, because he's the guy who's articulating how this is so very different, right? That the execution of this, because of the politics that surround it, change the formula, change how this, in an important way. So it's safe, right? It's safe. One of the assumptions, too, in all of this, by the officials that employ development, the people at a high level, are always suspicious, and intellectuals too, that it's rather like many other things that can gain a nation influence. With development goes, with development goes very sincere parts of the political program who's ever sponsoring it. So there's always that concern about it. So there's a lot of interconnection. The crisis in the 60s and 70s. It is at a high tide, and in fact, part of this book, even though it's very centered on the Americans are always, there's always a shadow for the Americans that they're worried about, which is the appeal of the Soviets, the Soviet model, later the Chinese, and they constantly are fretting that our efforts in South Korea are not as successful as we want them to be, or they're not successful very much at all. What does this mean in comparison to North Korea? What does this mean on the world stage? So it very much, and the fact that many newly independent states in the 50s and 60s are willfully looking to the Soviets, or communist or even neutralist states as this is the way we're going to do it, not the way you're offering us. Is part of the problem, but the breakdown is broader than that. I mean, it's the interesting thing is in the 60s and 70s, in the Soviet Union itself, there's a frustration with their own aid programs. There's a frustration with planning that mirrors what's going on in the West, because there's something in the process that's having trouble. And there are many social and political repercussions that didn't quite fit into the formula, but that are causing significant problems down the line. As invasive as these projects can be, and that they very, very often were very extensive, what's interesting is that it leads to a full spectrum of problems. Societies have political dislocation because there's a political element to this. There will be social dislocation because there are strong social, elements to this. At its worst, some of these programs displace people, they cause epidemic disease, and people realize this by the end of the 60s, that even some of the headlining programs have caused a full spectrum of issues. One of my favorite stories, is that the attention given to development is part of the problem as well. Scientists, researchers begin to look at it. There's an encyclopedia, literally almost put out, of research of it's called The Careless Technology, that looks at a whole swath of things that are going wrong. And my favorite story is that in Borneo, there are agricultural programs, social and education programs, and one of the components is, as I showed, to lavish insecticide on the countryside to get rid of the pests that are causing problems with the crops, making people sick, and it kills the villagers in this region, kills their cats, and it's an unintended consequence, right? But it's sort of, we have this technology, we're going to use it, kills the cats. Doesn't seem like a big problem, but all of a sudden the villagers are saying, we're overrun by vermin, we're overrun by rats. So this is when the British control Borneo, so the Royal Air Force has to airdrop cats to these people. If it gives you an idea of the, that these big, broad, extensive programs, political trouble, these sort of broad things we sort of sketch in get down to the point where they're leading to people having to deal with vermin in their homes. So, and that's a problem with the actual process. So.
Thank you. Let me just open it up to questions from Don.
Yeah, I'm Don Wolfensberger, director of the Congress Project here at the Wilson Center, but a former Peace Corps volunteer in Tanzania. When those Tanzanian students were visiting the Norris Dam, I was probably training at Syracuse to go over to Tanzania, but as a teacher. But I enjoyed your talk very much. I'm playing off of what John said about development being as American as apple pie. I would kind of take issue with that, because I think on the one hand we do see a great outpouring every time there's a natural disaster or some kind of a disaster in the world, as we have seen in Haiti and with the tsunami before, and people pour out their hearts, their pocketbooks, and so on. But when it comes to supporting government development assistance, the support is not really there. People think that we're giving a lot more money to other countries than we are. When we have a recession such as we have now, you'll see people saying, keep the money at home. We're already sending our jobs overseas. Why should we be sending foreign aid over there? So it's a hard sell, and it'll be interesting to see what does, if anything, come out of this review that's going on in the administration in terms of reorienting foreign aid. One thing that I've noticed recently is, well, two things. One is the military is assuming a lot more of the nation-building duties in places like Afghanistan with the counterinsurgency idea, and I'm wondering what your reaction is to that. Will it be successful? Can it have any lasting effect? But the other thing is the way the Chinese are strategically going around the world, but especially even in the Caribbean, Latin America, and so on, with some very high-profile development projects. My wife and I visited a couple of Caribbean islands in the last few years, and one they point with pride to that new soccer stadium over there. The Chinese built that for us, and now they've turned it over to us to maintain, and so on. Another island, their big sport was cricket, believe it or not. Well, the Chinese built that cricket stadium for us, same thing. So they're very high profile. I don't know whether they're doing other things on the ground. When I was in Tanzania, the Chinese had doctors and nurses in the hospital, and my students would come back with sayings of Mao in Swahili and give me a copy, but it was kind of fun. But I'm just wondering, whether this new competition, both with the Chinese and with trying to help countries where there might be breeding grounds for terrorism, if that's going to help any in selling foreign aid in your mind, or whether it's going to be another drop in the bucket, or something like Johnson with his Mekong Delta TVA project that didn't really come off. Are we going to have high hopes but little in the way of delivery?
As a historian, I'll take the, if I could see the future, I wouldn't be doing this. I'll say that the lessons from the past shouldn't. No one should get a good night's sleep if you know the lessons of the past and look at the potential success of Afghanistan and Iraq and other places. Particularly for the way the system's set up. I mean, John's very astute. He knows the structure of the American foreign aid apparatus, which I would call more of a Rube Goldberg contraption than an apparatus of any sort. And I don't think it bodes well. I'll give one small anecdote that I have a former Marine who had been over in Iraq and had been doing basically like what the provincial reconstruction teams are doing in Iraq. I don't know if in Iraq they're called that, but had basically been doing, as part of counterinsurgency, offering development aid on a small scale. And we had a seminar on the history of development. I gave him a book by Michael Latham, which looks at a few vignettes in a few cases in the Kennedy period, a very, very narrowly focused book, but it looks at Vietnam under Kennedy. And he came in and he basically said, if I had read this, we wouldn't have done some of the things that we did. And that, when you get to the military, is that, I've heard a whole bunch of other stories that the military is very hungry for knowledge about this because they don't know, but they've been handed this, which is another thing that doesn't give me confidence. The thing that gives any kind of hope for that is that the military is willing to learn, but that the knowledge base isn't there. USAID has been gutted compared to what it was in the 1960s, and aid was not it wasn't a litany of failure, but aid was not completely successful even in the 1960s. As for China, it's an interesting thing that John cited my sort of scholarly and generalized comments, but the more plural discourse and the more plural world of development is the interesting part. Is China's now very much an engaged donor, but as you say, that's not actually something new. I love these articles that talk about China and Africa, but China's been in Africa for a very long time. And so interestingly enough, have places like Taiwan. The U.S. actually took technicians from Taiwan and sent them to Africa and other parts of the developing world in the 60s and 70s to compete directly with Chinese efforts, but that China, is using it as any power does, and as the U.S. does as well, to enhance its influence, as much as do good. I just remember I was in Ethiopia 2 years ago, and being taken around by an Ethiopian reporter. And the Chinese were building an overpass as part of a road system in Addis Ababa. And, I just sort of asked him about it, got a few opinions, and he said, the thing we really like, very earnestly, he said, the thing we really like about the Chinese is that they're fast, and they don't ask too much from you, which was a backhanded way of saying, like, there aren't all of the restrictions and this and that, and, you have to, I shouldn't say lip service, but talk about corruption and democratization and this and that. They'll just build this for you. That was his view, and that's, I think, one thing that where there's an attraction. And I'll also say when you say the appeal for the U.S. For foreign aid to the government, for the American public getting behind the government, giving more in foreign aid, I think. The war on terror, such as it is, has made that more marketable, but hasn't assured it public support, obviously. But I will say one thing in terms of the government. Development never left the American public. A lot of foundations, a proliferating group of NGOs from the 70s onward, but particularly in the 1990s, are invested in this, and there are thousands and thousands of Americans whose focus is development. and millions and billions of dollars coming out of, what we might broadly call civil society. And I would say, interestingly enough, even when there's this disorganization on the part of the U.S. government and even the aid community, I think, William Easterly is, you can take or leave certain things he says, but he has one great word for where the development community is, and he calls it muddle right now. And I think he's absolutely right. But for all of this, that there are, there are numerous private groups, and leading the charge. And again, you can take or leave what he's saying is Jeff Sachs. Even in this official sort of uncertainty, Jeffrey Sachs has gotten a global audience, gotten a lot of support within American non-governmental groups, foundations. Again, take it or leave it. And he's very aggressively articulated this mission that appeals to a lot of people. At least key and important people, showing that there's still that market for it. And I bring him up for one other reason. When he talks about what he wants to do, he relates it sometimes to the TVA, interestingly enough. So, yeah. Anyway, does John want to say any of those? Those are things that touch on things that John knows a lot more than I do.
I don't think that's true, but let me just make a few reactions. One retrospective. I don't think you can underplay. Well, let me put it the other way around, because we were asked about the great ideologies. It is clear that in reaction to unbridled capitalism, which is what we all suffered from in the late 19th century and the early 20th century, the debate about a very central question is what is the role of the state, what's the role of the private sector, has been central. And the reason you got fascism for a lot of historical reasons specific to Germany, and you got the rise of I don't want to call it Marxism, but it's I guess Russian communism, was a very strong debate over the role of the state in providing both economic growth and improved social well-being. And the Germans did it very well. I mean, it's worth remembering while we're arguing about a national health care scheme that Bismarck put one in the late 19th century, if I remember correctly, and a minimum wage. Not for reasons of altruism, by the way, but to keep a satisfied workforce. And we learned from the Great Depression that the costs of unregulated capitalism are extremely high in both an economic and a social sense. And that, of course, informed based on the progressive movement, the New Deal. And the New Deal was seminal for those of us who grew up in it. And it was very important in governing, as David writes very articulately and in detail, about the influence of all of the New Deal programs on U.S. concepts of development and modernization. And there's two seminal events, really, for the U.S. in how they see development were Vietnam and probably the demise of the Great Society, which is in your book, because these were the pinnacle of the belief that the U.S. could change societies. Vietnam failed abysmally. It's the wrong thing to do in the first place, but obviously we weren't modernizing a state that didn't want to be modernized. And the Great Society, because the politics were extremely tough, and it turned out to be much harder than anybody expected to eliminate poverty in the United States for a whole variety of reasons, of social and economic and other reasons, and obviously segregation. And the U.S. has never recovered from those two factors, and there isn't a development consensus for that reason. But I want to remind people of one thing. No matter what you may think of U.S. policy, and David's book's a great contribution to this, I can make you the argument, if I'm debating, that development's been a great success. That anywhere you look in the world, growth rates are up. There are many more countries who govern, for better or for worse, their own societies. The poverty is way down, measured by the very low income statistics of the World Bank, and will continue to go down. And countries that once considered basket cases, starting with South Korea, which would never grow without continuing support from the outside, particularly from the U.S., And now India growing 10% a year, and are huge competitors and markets for the United States. So it's a quite different world. People are much better off. The position of women in most societies is better off than it was, despite egregious examples of this. So there is a case that development has happened and modernization has happened in ways that are, on balance, beneficial. What hasn't changed, of course, is the theory of how we do it has proven to be wrong in all too many cases. But we've also, the lessons of that have been internalized. One of the first lessons is, which is very tough, particularly for Americans to assume, is nothing's going to happen unless the country wants to have it happen. There now have been 2 massive studies of, and no matter what the World Bank says or the IMF says, which has tended to be very wrong, the countries that have grown continuously for 25 years, there are only about 25 of them. A lot of countries that have grown fast, but haven't grown fast for long periods of time, have done it in a very unique way, bearing nothing to do with the academic community in this country and elsewhere, or what the World Bank says and everything else. You know them as well as I do, starting with China and the 4 Asian tigers, and now India, and so on and so forth. So we don't have a doctrine of how to promote development, and that's one of the things should happen now, particularly when it's a world that's quite different. If you told me that India was going to have a very large aid program in Afghanistan, is building roads from Kabul to the Iranian border, I would have said you're absolutely crazy, and so on and so forth. So for the U.S., it's got to figure out what it wants to do and how it is going to do it in this quite changed world. As I said earlier, what we do in terms of overall foreign and economic policy is much more important than anything we're going to do with aid. The continuing reliance on aid is misleading us in what we should be doing. I'll give you an interesting data bit, is that the organization that is the trade association of the private voluntary agencies working overseas did a study. And those agencies, who also take government money, raise privately $9 or $10 billion a year. Privately, that's the only money they got from donations or whatever the case may be. That makes them a larger aid donor than France in terms of absolute money. So you've got a much different world in what is happening that we haven't taken full account of. And then I'll stop because people have their own questions to ask.
Let me just put in a plus, since we're talking about Afghanistan, for anyone interested in sort of informing their following of the news coming out of Afghanistan and the challenges that the U.S. faces in Afghanistan right now. Just published a working paper number 60 by Artemy Kalinovsky, on the challenges faced by the Soviet Union in their Afghanistan adventure. And it makes for absolutely fascinating reading to see how things change and how they stay the same. So yeah, mostly stay the same.
Can I say 2 quick things? And I'm sorry to just 2 quick things. And one thing that just to spin off what John said is 2 things that are connected to this. Is that development is very much bound up in sort of larger discussions of political economy, like what is the predominating way that the state should be involved, or the private sector. That's in the background in this story. And one of the things that John brings out is that, I said it more succinctly than I did in my book, is one of the reasons the U.S. is competing in the 50s and 60s is because many developing nations don't trust liberal capitalism. And they look to the Soviet Union and China because they've successfully developed. It's not only a positive tale, but it's a negative tale that they look at the West and they're like, you brought us the Depression. You brought us imperialism. Why would we want a system that recapitulates that? Because when you bring that approach to development in, you bring, right, that political content with it. And that's something we should probably be aware of now, is that some of our larger ways we conceptualize how liberal economies work is not so savory abroad. And then I'll leave it there and open it up.
Hi, my name is Erin Chapman. I'm a research assistant here. I just wanted to ask about the connection between imperialism and some of these things. You mentioned that this idea of the civilizing mission was one of the intellectual antecedents of the TVA and development broadly. And I just wondered, it's interesting to me that this all sort of takes place in the post-colonial moment, right after the British Empire has fallen apart. And I just wondered if Lynn Leothal and the people who are thinking about this, imagine development to be sort of an extension of the white man's burden, or if they were thinking about it in ways that were more post-colonial. And I just wanted your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I would say Lilienthal's thinking about it in a post-colonial manner, but not everybody is. And part of a story I didn't tell, that there's a wonderful book to be written, is as much as there's a connection between the Americans are looking at what the Soviets are doing. I gesture to it in the book. It's that colonial powers are looking at TVA too. I mean, France starts a hydraulic program in Indochina. The British are interested in this as part of a way, are interested in some of these ideas as a way of making their colonies more efficient, making them pay, making them work better, and this is in the 30s. And there are a lot of colonial or Commonwealth development programs that emerge that the British start in the post-war period as part of the Cold War. So there's an interconnection here that the Americans very often deny. There's often frustration on the part of recipients that people who show up working with the UN and some of the international bodies are people who have come out of colonial offices. Right? These people who sort of recast themselves as international civil servants are often, there's that connection. And there's also there's just the fact that the Americans themselves, I say this in the book, that the Americans, when they go and they say to a country in the developing world, you want us to provide you aid, look at what we've done in our South. They don't say, look at what we did in the Philippines, look at what we did in Puerto Rico. It's in some ways, the TVA has its own appeal for its own accomplishments and the own way people are excited about it, but it's also deployed in a way that allows the U.S. to distance itself from its own colonial past in a certain way. So there are all these linkages, but when you get down on the ground, for a lot of Americans, particularly the generation that's evolving, in the 50s and 60s, who are joining the Peace Corps, who are joining government agencies, the various NGOs, you can find chauvinism, you can find sometimes a little bit even of racism toward the people they're working with, but you don't find a colonial attitude. And that actually is a big shift. There's imperfect views, but it's not that they conceptualize their mission as colonialists on the ground, at least a lot of the people I've looked into. So.
Yeah, let me take a couple of questions. So let's start there, and then we'll be back here.
Dan Lieberman. Yeah, I was just kind of interested in why India is doing all of these plans in Afghanistan. The only thing I can think of want to counter Pakistan, but I think India, I believe its embassy was attacked. I think they've suffered quite a few blows because of that. And it would seem that Afghanistan being, a very extreme Muslim, radical Islam nation, wouldn't favor India intruding on them, and they wouldn't be helping the Karzai government at all from that standpoint.
Okay, we'll just go that way. And we'll take those two other questions, and then we can get all the answers and be done.
I'd like to go back to the beginning of your story.
ID yourself, please. You can just ID yourself.
David Franke. I'd like to go back to the beginning of your story in the 30s and the 40s. And with TVA as the centerpiece, I can see how you see this as a specifically sort of liberal approach. But I'm wondering if there's something even broader at work here, looking at Herbert Hoover, who's not normally considered a liberal, and his work before he became president, is sort of a engineering mentality and approach to solving problems. Do you go into that at all?
And then last question right back there.
Devin Fergus, Wilson Fellow. David, I very much enjoyed your talk. As you probably well know, there's a large and growing body of scholarship about modernization theory and technology And so I'd like to talk about the technologies of liberalism at some level. And the argument is that for everything, there's a reaction. And so with the rise of technology, there's the accident or the unintended consequence. So with the train, there's a train wreck. With the car, there's a car wreck. And the rise of modern financial industry or financial modernization, right, financial instruments, there's the subprime meltdown, right, with again, prepayment penalties, all that. So everything there's an opposite reaction. So I get your sense of what do you see as the technological wreck, the main technological wreck, something beyond dropping cats in Borneo, the main technological wreck of this liberal interventionist project. And the second thing, you mentioned James Scott. Part of the problem, I think, with the critique of the modernization school about the technologies is that it sort of creates a victim in the pacification of that person. And Scott, obviously, anthropologist Scott, James Scott, right, talks about infrapolitics, right? And that's individuals and persons on the ground who react and respond to the state and the actions of the state, right? And so first off, your response to who are the primary, what's the primary sort of wreck taking place here with the technologies of liberalism? And then secondly, so we simply don't have a sort of a victimology here. How are people on the ground, and you use the phrase frequently, on the ground, how are people on the ground responding to these technologies of liberalism that are taking place?
All right, and all that in 10 minutes or less.
Okay, I'll have to. I think India's actions in Afghanistan are fascinating, personally, but I can't speak to their aid program, so I'll have to punt on that one. But it's an interesting. It's probably a great session for the Wilson Center to do at some point. On Hoover, I do mention Hoover. Hoover is definitely out of this interest in solving problems. You can take a social issue, break it down, and solve it with a technological intervention, right? And engineering is one of the ways to do this, one of the key ways to do this. And he is, he is a person who is heavily involved with American foreign aid. It's almost forgotten, but his work he does in Belgium, but also post-World War I across Central and Eastern Europe, that has enormous impact. But even Hoover himself, and in part, I think, because he gets uncomfortable with some of the elements of the New Deal and developmentalism, actually distances himself from this. And in fact, when he writes his memoirs, when he talks about, and I forget the name of his organization that does the relief, he doesn't cast it as developmental. He casts it as just relief. This is not, people pulling themselves up by their bootstraps. And there is there's a developmentalist element in that, but it doesn't persist. That's why it doesn't become a focus of the book, and also because it's not sort of part of this, what I see as a pretty profound change in the 1930s, when development takes on a very different strategic cast. That's one big difference. But Hoover is definitely part of we can solve these problems with technology, which is one of the longer histories of developmentalism. The technologies of liberalism. Interesting question. What are the main responses to the technologies of this? That I see. There are many, and I pull them out in the crisis of when I talk about the crisis of development. But there are political ones that start. That there's always a political reaction. Either very often on the people receiving, but at home too. There's always a political reaction to what the implication of this is. Gets back to the state and the place of the state. There are reactions from various constituencies. It can be political, but the big one I highlight is. That really gains traction in the 1960s is the environmental reaction, that there are real costs to this. Not only does it damage societies, politics, and the places where this is being done, but by extension it damages the global commons. Right? There's a growing discussion of spaceship Earth, right? A lot of things we now take as very part and parcel of public discussion of environmental issues, but are really rooting themselves in the 1960s, and that, you know, you build the Aswan Dam, you change the, you know, you displace people in Egypt, you damage, you know, you change agriculture, you damage certain parts of society in Egypt, that's important, but you change the characteristics of the Mediterranean Sea, and therefore you affect Europe, you affect part of the global commons. There are things like that that people see. So the environmental pushback is a pretty profound one, but even that is negotiated at various different levels, because in the developing world, the response that you heard at Copenhagen of developing countries saying, essentially, this is a rich man's problem. Like, we're not as worried about environmental degradation, we're worried about alleviating poverty through development. But that I see as one major pushback, right, is the environmental one. The victimology, how is this being played out on the ground? You know, obviously, it's different things at different times. You have everything from client state governments either embracing or wrestling with aid, embracing it as a way to cement their own authority, or wrestling with it when the Americans say, you know, we want you, South Korea, to be a rice exporter. And the South Koreans say, no, we want to be an industrialized country. This is a persistent debate while South Korea, and that's at a governmental level. But you might find protests. I don't go into this, but the U.S. government, this is one of the invasive elements sort of recurring. The U.S. government will say, South Korea needs to be a market it needs to have a place in the world economy, crucial part of the East Asian economy. It needs to be a market for Japanese goods, also needs to supply agricultural goods to Japan. That's its comparative advantages. That's what we're deciding as the United States. And they have pushback from the Republic of Korea government. But what that means is we're going to export your rice, Korean farmers, and we're going to ask you to eat barley. Or, and they do similar things in Vietnam. We're going to import wheat and barley, or you're going to grow that because that's simpler to grow. And you're going to eat that, and we're going to teach you how to eat that. And they get pushback on that. Obviously, people don't like this. People, hoard. People aren't honest about what they've grown. And that's, maybe that's a little more subtle, but it's that, people can be victimized by this, but there's also a lot of pushback and negotiation. I should say one of the things in the book is that I note this and I talk about certain cases, but there are wonderful books to be written about the moment where this catches, and that it's and one, I'll get on a soapbox for a second too. I'll go on a little bit, but say that there's not in this case there's not a South Korean response to American development aid and the aid extended by the UN and NGOs. There are responses from Korean constituencies, right? At one moment, the Korean government may love this because the Americans dumped $300 million on you. Great, I can hand it out to my guys. If I'm Sigmund Rhee, assure my power for certain Korean industries, for certain landlords. This is great. For other people, this may be, for certain farmers, it may be great. There may be American fertilizer and seeds flowing. For other people, it may be something you need to push back on. Local elites, this and that. So there's not the Korean response or the Iranian response. There are various constituencies that are fighting, pushing and shoving. As I like to say, you need to think, sometimes I think it's useful to step back, and it might be useful for people involved in development today to think this way, as if, you came into Washington, D.C. as a foreign power and said, we're going to reform, city government or the city schools. You'd find people who were willing to collaborate with you. You'd find people who would resist you tooth and nail. You'd find people who wouldn't care, and that would complicate the whole equation. So, yeah, sometimes a group's victims, things change and they're tolerant of it. So it's a flexible thing. Anyway, did I get anywhere close to? Yeah.
Well, thank you, David. Thank you, John. Thank you all for coming here today. And please visit the website, and then we have a few events coming up in the next couple of months. There are books available for purchase outside, and I'm sure David will be sticking around for a few minutes to just sign a few copies. should you choose to purchase one. So thank you all for coming again. Thank you, David.
One last point.
Thank you.
Yeah.
For those of you who deal with the dismal science of aid and aid policy, there's a paper on the Wilson Center website, which you can get by going to my name, called Foreign Aid Redux, which will give you a fairly good assessment of what's wrong with everybody's foreign aid programs. Because there's one idea I want you to leave with, that aid is important in some cases and has done a lot of good things and a lot of bad things, but it's not the crux of the relationship of the U.S. relationship with development and modernization.
And I'll second that it's worth your time. I've read it, so.
Thank you.